testosterone. Anyone out there? Anyone can hear me? The testosterone thing was a joke in the Futurama video game for the settings when you wanted to adjust the volume. It had Seth Brannigan go testosterone.
It's nice. I thought it was an own original joke. I would have
No,
totally
no.
credited it.
None of my jokes are original. I'm just old enough to remember stuff that other people haven't yet seen.
Yeah, I never really got into that Futurama. I never watched it, unfortunately.
Oh, it was fun.
Yeah, I have a colleague who's constantly referencing it as well. So maybe I should catch up on it.
Okay, what I have figured out is that we are definitely audible.
Perfect.
Which means I definitely have to mute the stream on YouTube, because otherwise I'll hear myself double, and we don't want that. Hey, Britain's there. Very well. Okay, let's get this started officially. Welcome back, everybody, to the monthly Marxist Malcontent. And as we have recently found out, the world is ruled by childless cat ladies. And I, as someone who wants to speak truth to power, decided to go right to the source and ask a childless cat lady on the stream, which is Clio, the Bemuzed Bookworm. Welcome very much. I'm very glad you're here. Who are you? Do you want to tell people about you and
first
ruling
of
the world?
all, thank you for that lovely introduction. I also have one of my cats here in the shot even, so to make that introduction even more perfect. But so yeah, my name is Clio. I have a channel over on YouTube called Bemuzed Bookworm, and I am a booktuber. I am 36 years old, and I am Belgian. And as a consequence, I felt like I had to join you with a Belgian beer, of course. So I will be drinking Kriek Lindemans during this stream.
Well.
And don't come at me, Belgians, for not having the proper glass.
Cheers. Okay, and hello, hello Britain, and hello Chadia, and hello also, who made the lovely thumbnail. Heyo. Wow, there's actual people here. So yeah, let's get started and just talk a bit about stuff. So you have a booktube channel. You have recently found out that it is like 3 years old, 4 years old, 6 years old, something like that.
6 years old, weirdly enough.
6 years old. So your booktube channel is going to school soon, right?
My channel is going to school soon, yes. My channel has reached an almost amazing subscriber count of 500 in 6 years, but slow and steady.
Well, hopefully a few new people will subscribe after this conversation. So yeah, go and check out Clio's channel and subscribe. It's very interesting. Also cats. And yeah, I think what we usually want to start with is sort of like what you're usually reading versus, and why you're talking about the books that you're talking about, and what kind of got you into the whole booktube thing, and then we'll kind of take it from there and start talking about all kinds of other stuff.
Yeah, sure. I'm mainly reading fantasy. At the time in which I started my channel, I think I was reading far less fantasy, because I basically was reading a ton of fantasy when I was a teenager, and then at university I did like language studies, and so I had to read a lot of the classics and a lot of literary fiction, and then I kind of also got sucked into that genre where I was like reading that one a whole ton, and so fantasy was just kind of my escape outside of the class, outside of like the required reading. But then when I started working, I kind of stopped reading fantasy for a while, and then don't actually remember when, but probably 6.5 years ago, I found out about BookTube, and I was like, okay, I really love this content, and why don't I just start a channel like that as well, just to have somebody to talk about the books that I read, even if it's, like even if nobody's listening, it'll be a way for me to remember what I've read and to document what I'm reading. And so nowadays it's mainly fantasy. I still read other stuff, but I feel like it's definitely like highly focused on fantasy at the moment.
Mhm. That's like the thing because like I know from like conversations we have that you also read or have read a lot of more, literary fiction, classic stuff, and so forth. And like, and you still read things like that. I remember that you definitely look at stuff like the long lists and short lists for the Booker Prize and things like that. Smart people literature. And I'm like, is it like a deliberate choice to not talk that much about those things on BookTube? Is this sort of like just something that has developed over time, or are you just or yeah are you sort of like keeping your your serious literary side away from booktube?
It's definitely not an intentional keeping it away from booktube. I think it's more of a like I'm reading too much fantasy at the moment to have the time for the rest, and I do kind of want to go back to reading more of that as well. And once I get back to zero TBR, hopefully I'll be able to do that to some extent.
Mhm.
But it's definitely not intentional. And actually, they do like the videos, like some of the videos that have done the best on my channels have been about like classics and about the Booker Prize. So it would also do my channel some good, I guess, if I were to go back to that.
If you ever decide to become a grind tuber. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see because I don't watch that much booktube, but I see that there is sort of like this weird separation. You have like the serious literature booktubers that some people may call lit bros or whatever. You have those people, and then you have like the fantasy people, and then you have like the YA and romantasy people, and very few channels sort of cover all of that, and it sometimes seems like no one's actually talking to the other people and sort of looking down on the literary people, looking down on the fantasy people, the epic fantasy people looking down on the YA people and the romantasy people, and everyone on YouTube looking down on the people on TikTok. And I sometimes wonder whether even trying to sort of cover more than one specific segment would sort of lead to sort of annoying all sides of your potential audience.
Yeah, there's of course that kind of hesitation with it to some extent of being like the people that I've now gathered to my channel are mainly interested in fantasy. And so the hesitation there is that if I were to shift more to literary fiction, for example, then some people might be like, I'm totally not interested in that. And as a consequence, like you lose views and your channel gets even less visible to the world out there. Um, but I do like the idea of being more of a sort of like overall booktuber, being somebody who reads like many genres rather than being like really focused on one specific
Yeah.
genre.
Yeah, the people getting annoyed that you're no longer talking about Brandon Sanderson, but about people calling Jose something something in the fifth generation or so.
Well, actually, tomorrow should have a Brandon Sanderson video if I manage to edit it tomorrow.
Oh, which one?
So I'm going to be reading the chapters for Wind and Truth, which are being released like on a weekly basis
Hmm.
on the Reactor Magazine website. So I'm going to be reading those and reacting to them, even though the
Because they're
first
on Reactor.
yeah, even though my first experience already makes me think like I'm like the worst possible person to react to this Brandon Sanderson stuff because I don't know all of the ins and outs of the Cosmere.
So, Chadia, are you saying I should not become a litfic girl, or are you saying Clio should not become a litfic girl?
Neither one, probably.
Probably. Well, I mean, now that I am on my serious magical realism journey, I guess I have to struggle hard on that one.
Yeah, yeah. Or you need to overcompensate for having liked 100 Years of Solitude by just going hard on the fantasy for a while.
Yeah, I have to expiate that by reading another 10 Drizzt books, I guess. Yeah, neither. But I think like what I find interesting is like obviously I do from time to time also dabble in reading classics or serious literary fiction books, and I do enjoy those. And I think they help me sort of read fantasy and appreciate what fantasy does when fantasy authors use sort of like tricks they have maybe learned from reading other books as well. And I think it makes me talking about fantasy, it makes it easier for me to talk about fantasy, or I can talk more about fantasy simply because I also have read other stuff. in a way. And I think that's sort of like a benefit, even if I don't do serious literary content, I can still sort of pretend or use literary words from time to time when I talk about dudes with swords.
Yeah, I guess, maybe this is our way to make like a fantasy booktube more esteemed. It's just like making comparisons between the big classics and the fantasy books that we're reading.
Yeah, Ori, I agree with you. Reactor, I mean, obviously, even when it was just Tor.com, it was already like a very good general like website and magazine. And I kind of see why they split it from the publisher, because it had become its sort of um, own entity, sort of almost separate from the publisher in a lot of ways. So I agree. It's a great magazine. It's obviously having that financial backing allows it to do things that other web online magazines can't necessarily do. So they have a benefit, like sort of like a bonus there and an advantage there. But it's a good magazine.
Yeah, it's my first experience with it.
Yeah, I mean, wasn't here, I mean, they did as Tor.com as the website versus just Tor the publisher. They did publish a bunch of like novellas. They have this series of like wonderful novellas. Spear by Nicola Griffith was originally published by Tor.com, obviously not online, but they have done this kind of stuff before, and they always have interesting short stories on their website and book reviews. And they do a lot of sort of having authors review other authors' books, and sometimes do like a look back at like classic books and stuff. They're definitely a valuable resource for fantasy fans online. But yeah, I mean, I've seen other people do the Wind and Truth chapter reaction discussion things on BookTube, so I assume they will be doing well for you as well, because yeah, people like that stuff.
We'll see. Because I don't know how interesting it will be, but now I'm like, oh yeah, right. I don't remember the name of this person, or like, oh wait, that name rings a bell. Who was this again?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it also kind of depends on when you read the last Cosmere book. Like, I think it was like sometime last year when you read some of the Secret Project books, I think.
Yeah, but I just read another one of them in July, and and in
Oh,
that one I kind of, because I was just editing my July wrap up right before this,
yeah.
and in this one I'm basically kind of saying that what I don't really like about it, the Cosmere anymore, is how interconnected it is getting. And I feel like this book is going to do exactly that. And the
Yeah.
prologue was already immediately me being like, wait, who is this guy? Because this is a guy from another planet, and I don't really remember which planet or which book.
Yeah. Hello, Ben. Yeah, I think for me, the interesting thing with, and I'm going to read the Cosmere later this year, because my goal is to read at least a selection of Cosmere novels all the way up to Wind and Truth, which for some reason I always want to call Wind and Fury, which would be a much better title, I think, but that's just me.
Mhm.
um, and I'm going to read those, and we'll see how I like them. I mean, I have read some Sanderson before. I've read the first Mistborn trilogy, and I've read Alloy of Law, and
Hmm.
uh, that was like decades ago. So I feel I might not be as forgiving now than I was back then.
Yeah, Alloy of Law is like for me last year probably, or the year before that I started that trilogy, or like, yeah, it's actually 4 books, but yeah, that was not for me. I don't like Mistborn Era 2, unfortunately, but many people don't. So
I think like I've only read Alloy of Law, and I think that one worked well for me, because um, the sort of like buddy cop kind of thing that he does with Wax and Wayne in that first one, I think works really well for Sanderson's writing style. His absolute lack of humor that he nevertheless uses to make really dumb jokes all the time works really well with that specific set of characters in a way that it didn't necessarily work in the Wheel of Time books that I read by him, and that it didn't necessarily work in Mistborn Era 1, but it kind of works there because it is already so sort of tropey and cheesy in a very specific way. It's like
yeah,
that's the one point where he can get away at being like a very prudish teenage boy with a weird hang up about humor.
Yeah, I can get that. But like that type of the way you describe it, like like a cop show and stuff like that. That is
Yeah.
exactly what I hate. I don't like don't like detectives, cop shows, like procedurals or anything like that. So yeah, that's immediately meant that this was not the series for me.
Yeah, that's the point. I'm not saying I love it. I'm saying his writing style works really well with this
Sure.
specific sort of subgenre. So I think they worked well in that regard in a way that other stuff didn't necessarily work. And yeah. Also I agree that like the more interconnected thing, and it's like obviously people have already compared the Cosmere to the Marvel Cinematic
Hmm.
Universe and stuff like that, and it's a deliberate tactic. It's a marketing tactic because it makes it easier to sort of keep audiences, like sell stuff to audiences, because they kind of have to also get this thing to understand this thing and so forth. It allows to sell a lot more marketing, a lot more products, and it allows to sort of bind your audience in a way that just writing single novels, for example, would not do. And that's I I can't look into Brandon Sanderson's head, but I think he's very deliberate about how he does build his business in a lot of ways, and I think that is certainly something he knows and that he does in that regard. And the trick is, of course, not overdoing it, because if you overdo it, then at some point you reach that breaking point where you only have like your diehard fans, and no one new will ever come into this because it's just too much.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's already there with the Cosmere or not.
So it's not there yet for me, but it's close, I feel like, to some extent. Like it's not like the Marvel universe, for example. I made an effort, like, I don't know, a year and a half ago to try and restart and like
Mm,
catch up to it. And then I just got to this point where I was like, you know what, I actually don't care anymore. And so now I just don't watch any of it anymore.
mm,
And so with the Cosmere, it's getting to the point where I'm like, I don't have the inside knowledge to fully enjoy it the way that I should, like the way that it's intended to. And so
mm.
that's causing some frustration.
Yeah, and exactly, Chad. Yeah, that's the point. It makes it harder for new people to get into it, especially when you have like a very gatekeepy kind of community that like you read your first novel and you go online and you ask one question on Reddit and 10,000 people come in and tell you that you first have to read these 50 books before you're even allowed to ask a question. That can turn people off. I don't know if Sanderson's community is that bad. I have not interacted with them.
Yeah, no idea neither. I haven't had much interaction with them neither. So
Hmm. See, and that's interesting. Like with that with those interconnected universes, I recently talked about that when I finished my latest reread of the Black Company books, because Glenn Cook does something really fascinating there. On the one hand, he usually uses, and Glenn Cook is someone who has very interesting, to me, oftentimes very poetic book titles, completely unconnected to the context of the book, but he has really cool book titles like Water Sleeps, Soldiers Live. Those are really cool book titles, and he uses those as like catchphrases in the book before the book. So in She Is the Darkness, the term water sleeps comes up a couple of times, and this saying water sleeps but enemy never rests gets mentioned, and then the next book is called this, and then in Water Sleeps they, because everyone's getting older, they're like, yeah, soldiers live and wonder why. And that is then the next book title. And he does that. And then he also name drops book titles from his other book series that are not even officially in the same universe as Black Company. He just name drops them out also as sayings. And those who have read, say, the Instrumentalities of the Night can go like, surrender to the will of the night. I guess that was a book that he also wrote. Or the other one was just like an ill fate marshalling or something like that, which is another from his Dread Empire series. And he does that in a very cheeky way, which sort of, how can I say, it, it's a nice bonus for those people who are diehard fans. But if you're not, you just can read over it, and it kind of doesn't matter. And it rewards fans, but it doesn't sort of expect fans to know stuff. And I think that's an interesting approach to it.
yeah, that's kind of what I enjoy more. It's more like
Mm,
Easter eggy, where
mm.
like you get hints to stuff, and then indeed, if you know it, then that's like an added bonus for you. But it doesn't really change anything about understanding the story.
Yeah. Look, I would never criticize Brandon Sanderson. I have never done this, and I will never do this. I'm pretty sure. Hey, Liam, and yeah, sorry you have to go to work. At least it keeps you reading Cyberpunk, I guess. Immortal Hulk. That sounds weird indeed. I've never gotten into comics for all kinds of reasons, and partly that's like just like classic Marvel and DC comics are not that big in Europe in general, and yeah, obviously comics are not necessarily the most accessible for blind people either. So, but yeah, no. Anyway, I will start reading the Cosmere later on. I'll start with Elantris, and then I'll go through Mistborn Era 1, and then I'll either just do Mistborn Era 2 after that and go then to the Stormlight Archive, or I'll read, what's it called? Warbreaker, I think. Maybe
Yeah.
that's the one that I'm thinking of that I should probably also read. But I don't want to go into all the side quests and stuff. I just want to have a general understanding, because when I'm coming for Brandon Sanderson, I don't want his fans to come at me and go like, well, but you have to read these books. I'm like, no, I've read 50. We're good.
Yeah, then it'll be like, yeah, but you miss Warbreaker, and there's a character of Warbreaker that blah 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 blah.
I'm pretty sure. Like I will not look. I will not go and dissect the content and world building. That's not my point. I want to look at like larger things on like how his specific religious upbringing influences his writing, on how his writing style and the way he plots books and so forth reinforce the way he sells his stuff. That's sort of what I want to look at. I don't want to look at like a specific in-world conflicts and stuff. There's enough people doing that.
No.
I don't make lore videos. That's for someone else. Lore is boring in general. But yeah, do you read comics and graphic novels? Because obviously I don't. And you're Belgian. You're supposed to, right?
I mean, I read some, of course, when I was a kid. You know, I read Asterix comics and like the
Everyone in Europe has that.
the Yommikes and Kiekaboo and stuff like that. I read quite a few of them, but like it didn't really transition into adulthood or anything like that. I just read them and the ones that we had at home, but I was never really a big like fan to the extent that I consumed them once like my own money was involved.
Okay. Like one thing that I found interesting is like you read a lot of stuff from non-English authors, sometimes in translation, sometimes in I don't know, your 4 different Spanish editions of 100 Years of Solitude. How many languages do you actually speak or read?
Well, read we can definitely narrow down, I guess, to Dutch, English, and Spanish, though my Spanish is not where it was when I just studied it. I could potentially read French. I tried to read A Winter's Promise in French, but I also DNF'd that book, so that might say something about my level of French.
Or the
And
book.
then I also have some basics in Chinese, but definitely not reading basics in Chinese. Let that be clear.
We'll see about that also. If I make a mock lore video, you have to make a very funny thumbnail for that, though. That would be really funny, just to completely explain the Cosmere wrong and just completely wrong, like the Cosmere explained, and just like
I'm pretty
and
sure
see how
you
many
will
people
have.
real.
Yeah, you
What?
will have the Brandon Sanderson's fans then in your comments.
The question is like how many people would actually realize that it's a joke, right? And how many people are because media literacy, especially on the internet, is obviously a very interesting thing.
But I also still think that he's still so niche that only the people who really read him will actually check out a video like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I found it really interesting recently when I talked about the what's it called? The Keanu Reeves China Mieville book, the Book of Elsewhere, and I made it like a throwaway joke about comic books being only for children and non-blind people, and someone made a really angry comment and go like, well, you lost me when you said comic books are for children. Comics are serious, and a lot of serious literature has been inspired by comic books. And I'm like, bro, this was supposed to be a joke. I thought it was obvious, right? Apparently
Yeah.
it wasn't.
It's not. I also had that recently myself. I don't actually remember what it was, but there was some sort of a Twitter post in which I was like,
Mm.
"Wait, this has to be like a joke or what?" Right? And then
Mm.
afterwards, when I finally figured out what the actual joke was, I was just like, "Okay, nobody can know that I didn't see this from the get-go because it was just so stupid of me not to realize." But luckily, I don't post. I just think these things to myself.
If you make art for it also, then we can have like really funny art bits in there. Like I'll talk about something fantasy and you just like put a robot in it in the background and something like, yeah, that's totally part of the Cosmere right there. The Lord Ruler clearly has this robot army. I've heard about it.
Mhm.
I still remember he's called the Lord Ruler. I'm impressed
Yeah,
by my memory.
indeed.
I guess I can make a law video.
Yes. Make it now before you actually read the
The
Sanderson book.
Cosmere explained by someone who hasn't read it.
Yes. It'll get clicks, I'm sure.
Yeah. That's the sad part. Everything that involves the name Brandon Sanderson will always get clicks. You can count on that. That's obviously a bit annoying sometimes when you're like, well, I've read all these amazing books and no one wants to talk about them. But I make one dumb thing about Sanderson and suddenly there's hundreds of people watching it. But I guess we all know that problem on BookTube, that, trends are very, very driving, which is probably one of the things why your channel is not yet at 10,000 subscribers.
Yes, I guess. But it's also nice because like my channel is so small that I'm very happy that my best, like my most viewed video is a
Mhm.
review of Sayaka Murata, which I'm like, what do they mean reviews don't attract viewers? You just have to wait like 4 years and then it's your best viewed video.
I have not read I won't even try to pronounce the name. Sayaka Murata? Is that the name? Yeah.
Yes.
I have not read any of that. I have read 2 books by Japanese authors, and yeah. One was good. The other one didn't work for me.
The other one was Murakami, I assume.
Yeah, it was 1Q84, didn't work for me, and the Memory Police did work really well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think as with any type of literature, it's about finding the ones that work. In any
Yeah.
type of literature, you will have some that really don't work. I still have to find Irish authors that work for me. Irish for me, for some reason, does not work. But I'm sure that there are some out there. I just haven't found them. Just stumble upon the same deal all the time.
Using elemency on a robot sounds like, is that like knocking the robot out and just like stripping all the copper wire out of the robot? Is that how that works? But yeah, I think that's, yeah, there are, and that's like, I think, interesting that you have sort of these sort of cultural traditions that influence how people write books. And I am not interested enough in Japanese culture. Or I have never obviously I've never watched anime, I've never read manga, so I'm so far away from Japanese culture that a lot of the sort of cues that other people might get, I just like completely miss them, or they just like baffle me. And I know that at this point, if I wanted to get into Japanese culture, I just don't have the time to also get into this
Yeah.
another thing, right? and I feel like with I might enjoy 1Q84 more if I read it now. I read it back. I was like, I read it when it came out, is the point. And it was like praised by everyone. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna read like a new sort of science fiction-y, fantasy-ish, whatever book that everyone praises and everyone thinks is really good, and I'm gonna try this. And then it's just about this old guy who's weirdly obsessed with teenage girls, and there's 2 moons, and maybe that means something, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be weird if it's Murakami. Like there are only like
Yeah,
2 books that are normal by him, so I think it's always like a little bit of a test run when people read Murakami. You cannot really predict that somebody's going to like it or not because it's so weird. But I thought it was interesting because he had like an interview with Miko Kawakami, in which
Hmm.
she was explaining that, a lot of people thought that his depiction of women was not that great. And apparently he was just like, oh, really? I didn't know that people were saying that about me. I was like, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Two things. First of all, yeah, Shauna Lawless. I still have to read her, but the third book is coming out later this year. Chad. Yeah, I suppose you already know that. Um, but the interesting thing that I found with 1Q84 in memory, obviously, it's been like 20 years since I read it, so my memory is hazy. And when I compare it to my experience of reading the Memory Police felt more Japanese. 1Q84 felt by like someone trying to do American postmodern fiction and not quite getting it. There was this weird uncanny valley thing where he references so much Western culture stuff, and I'm like, he tries really hard to also be, I don't know, Thomas Pynchon in a way, but he's not quite getting it because he is obviously not American, and I think that's partly what annoyed me with 1Q84, and that didn't happen with Memory Police for me.
Yeah, he's definitely like, because he also is like the owner of a jazz cafe, and
Yeah.
so a lot of his books will indeed have references to Western culture, especially to like classical music and stuff like that. So he's definitely indeed like a westernized Japanese guy. He's definitely flirting with Western culture.
I still have to try Ishiguro. I'm pretty sure I will enjoy it. My flatmate is a big fan of all kinds of Japanese stuff, and has tried to learn Japanese, and he's a big fan of Ishiguro. And I'm definitely going to read more of it. But there's so much books to read.
Yeah, and Ishiguro is of course is very different than Murakami, and it's he's like British Japanese, so it's also it depends on which book you read, whether it's more Japanese or more like Western culture, not Western genre. Don't think he has the Western genre.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're kind of right there, Britton, with that he's a great author, a great Japanese author for a Western audience, because there is stuff that you can connect to. That might be right. I don't know. I think there was this time where everyone was reading Murakami, at least in Germany. That everyone was like, "Yeah, you got to read Murakami. He's so deep." And I'm like, I don't know, man. I go back to reading Drizzt, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's still definitely here, at least in Belgium, still a big name. I don't
Yeah,
think I really know many people who read a lot of his stuff. But like when his new book came out earlier this year, it was also a big thing here in Belgium, and it was like the thing that some of the bookstores are like publicizing, like, "Hey, we have the new Murakami in," so like it's still
yeah,
definitely a big seller.
yeah. That's like one of those things that I find so fascinating, that you have this sort of weird, serious literature or genre in a way that Murakami certainly kind of plays in, and you have like within that field, you have like, say, I don't know, one or two authors per country that are sort of not just for like the five people that actually read literary fiction, but are sort of like known, at least. It's sort of like almost famous in a way. And Murakami is certainly that for like Japanese literature, and you have like one or two of those in like different countries and different languages. And I find it interesting that he has sort of transcended that, and is both obviously a serious author that literary scholars and so forth talk about, but he's also someone that a lot of average people on the street might have at least recognized the name, even if they
Yeah,
haven't read it.
yeah, true. I guess it'll be like the same for like Isabel Allende is also
Mhm.
like a name like that. That
Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of. Like Allende is another one. Like, yeah,
yeah, that a lot of people will have heard of, maybe even read something by, even though they would never have otherwise picked up a Latin American author, maybe, or
yeah.
know of none other.
I have read exactly one Latin American author now. I think.
Yay!
A friend of mine is always telling me I should read Allende, and maybe I will in the future. Who
I've
knows?
also not yet read Allende. I really want to read The House of the Spirits,
Okay.
and I have it now. I think from the library, but the problem, like the delaying tactic, was always that it wasn't there in the Spanish edition in my library. The Spanish
Ah.
edition was like always like borrowed out, but now it is there. So now I have it here, but now I just never have the time for it. So I'm gonna have to return it at some point without having read it, probably.
Yeah. No, as I say, like now that I've read 100 Years of Solitude, I feel I have done my well, I haven't done enough magical realism for the next, I don't know, month or so.
So, are you going to continue along this magical realism path?
Possibly. I mean, it's definitely something that I find interesting. I have read some. I've read some Salman Rushdie in the past, who obviously claims to be part of a magical realism, or claims to do magical realism, and is clearly influenced by people like Garcia Marquez. And I get that, but I don't know. I like it from time to time. I like fiction that is sort of drifting into weird places and so forth. But it's not going to be my next big thing. I'll just like read time to time and maybe not even make videos about it, because who am I to talk about something like 100 Years of Solitude? But I wanted to reread it, read it, because I'm going to reread now Desolation Road by Ian MacDonald, which is very clearly, very heavily inspired. Now that I have read 100 Years of Solitude, I can see how it's very heavily inspired by 100 Years of Solitude. It's just on Mars.
Slight difference.
Yeah, but it does sort of the same thing. You have this village, town, whatever you want to call it, in the middle of nowhere that's sort of not supposed to be there, and you follow that like from its origins to its demise, and a lot of weird stuff happens with the families, the few like main families that live there and stuff. It's clearly inspired by that, and it also has this weird magical realism element to it, where stuff just happens that is never explained. It definitely is not realistic in a way.
Yeah, and does it then also have like the town is isolated at the beginning, but then like gets
Yeah, very much.
to the okay. And does it have the 20,000 names that are slight variations of the same name?
I don't remember many of the names, and I have just started the first chapter again, which is incredibly funny. Which is about a robot that wants to die.
Okay. Because that is just like my main memory of the first time reading 100 Years of Solitude, was just like constantly being like, no, not another Aureliano. Who is this?
Aureliano and Jose Arcadio.
Yeah, like, who are you? Get a new name.
Well, at least at some point you have Aurelio Segundo and Jose Arcadio Segundo.
And then occasionally, I guess there's like a name that's completely different. That's like a real breath of fresh air.
Yeah,
you're like, oh,
Fernanda.
this person I can remember.
Yeah. No, but I really enjoyed the book, though. I really, really enjoyed what he does and how he does these things. And it doesn't really matter that much whether you remember which Jose Arcadio you're just talking about, because it's usually relatively clear, like from the context, which one it is, sort of, even though they're usually all the same in a way. And when he even makes jokes about the twins that then maybe switched their names, and the one named Aureliano is behaving like a Jose Arcadio, and the Jose Arcadio is behaving like an Aureliano. And it's like, you've made it very clear that these are very much only abstracts here. Ori, you're right. She is from Mexico, but she lives in Canada, as far as I know. But yeah, she's a Mexican author, in the same way that Nala Hopkinson is a Caribbean author, even though she lives in Canada. Also, hey Peter, nice to see you here. Look, Britton, everyone likes Hyperion, and I'll say this: when it comes to Dan Simmons, Hyperion is his best. Like, it doesn't get better; it only gets worse from here on out. And it's fine to like it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not hating everything he's ever done. I'm just hating the person. How much Ishiguro have you read, Chadia, if I may ask? I mean, it also sounds like one of those like serious authors where I feel I can only read like one serious author per year, the way that I also can only do one author per year that makes me angry.
I think I've read like 3 Ishiguros, but I would really like to read Remains of the Day.
Hmm.
I just need more space between having watched the movie and reading the book for it to disappear from my brain a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, that's like an interesting question. Do you think it's better to read the book first and then watch the movie, or the other way around? Because they obviously always will sort of interact in your brain.
I think the other way around. Like the times in which I've watched the movie first and then read the book, I've been able to enjoy both more than the other way around. If I've read the book and then I see the movie or the TV show or whatever,
Hmm.
then I'm more likely to dislike it and be like, no, it's like this in the book. But if I've seen the movie first, it
Yeah.
might happen that I'm like, no, why is this thing from the movie not in the book? But then I won't resent the either one of them for it.
Hey, biggest, and yes, a cat. I don't know which one of the cats it is. I don't know the name in this
It,
case.
I think it was Buffy at that point in time, but they're
At that
both
point, it was
here.
Buffy.
This is Fate in any case, who's now just jumped in, and Buffy, both of them here now. So
See, providing prime cat content for you here. Yeah, Britain, don't try flashback. It sucks. It's really, really bad. It's insanely bad. It even has Day of the Rope references, which is sort of the point where I'm like, yeah, maybe don't. Maybe don't make Turner Diary references in your supposedly serious science fiction. Yeah, because I guess I will from now on only invite people on that have cats so we can keep the quality of the streams high. Okay, Britain, quick. The Day of the Rope is something that happens in the Turner Diaries. The Turner Diaries are a neo-Nazi white supremacist science fiction book that was found in the truck with Timothy McVeigh on the day when he bombed that city building and so forth. So yeah, it's absolute neo-Nazi trash. And the Day of the Rope is in that novel when all the white militia people finally get up and well, hang, lynch, murder a bunch of people that are either Black or Jewish or have been found to be friends or in relationships with Black or Jewish people. And yeah, Dan Simmons makes a very deliberate reference to that in flashback. And Bridger from the Library Ladder claims that it is not a political novel, but a psychological one. And I disagree. There's nothing psychological about featuring neo-Nazi stuff in your book. Yeah, that's an interesting take, Peter. There, like I found it so interesting recently when it comes to like reading the book or the movie. Like, I think it's easier to yes watch the movie first and then go to the book because usually books have more details and content and so forth. And if you read the book first, you'll always be disappointed by the stuff they leave out of the movie. Um, so I think yeah, that makes sense. What I found interesting recently when what's her name, Angela Collier, the astrophysicist. Who also does booktube stuff now, talked about that she never read Lord of the Rings and was confused by the fact that because and it's one of those things that I have to understand. There's a lot of people out there who call themselves fans of Lord of the Rings and don't know about the scourging of the Shire because they think it ends with with everyone being happy. Like,
I will
no.
say that I am like a Lord of the Rings fan who doesn't actually like the books all that much.
Oh, I didn't know you read them, Britain. That's I'm sorry for you. It's not a good book, but yeah. So yeah, that's that Day of the Rope that Simmons mentions, and I'm like, don't do that. Yeah, it's fine to not like the Lord of the Rings books. I'm totally fine with that. I just find it interesting that obviously the movies, for movie reasons, which I understand, left out that last part. But there are a lot of people who call themselves like rabid fans of Lord of the Rings, and they don't know that exists. They don't know. Like when Angela Collier did that, she's like, "Yeah, I didn't know that Frodo dies at the end." And I'm like, "Well, yeah, kinda."
Is that like Angela from Literature Science Alliance,
No, that's a
or
different one.
oh, okay, yeah,
No,
she's also
she had
science, so I was like,
yeah. No, Angela Collier has she has like a science channel. It used to be called A Collier Astro, and she changed it to Angela Collier recently. She does stuff on dark matter and quantum physics and
yeah, the stuff that I don't
science
get.
stuff. Yeah, she's interesting because she does that, and she also does like nerdy stuff, and she has like a second channel now, and there she does booktube stuff. Basically, she talked about
Okay.
a Canticle for Leibowitz, which is obviously a book that more people need to talk about and more people need to read because it's beautiful and sad and
Which
goes some unexpected
I
places.
can't. What did you say? Which book?
A Canticle for Leibowitz.
Okay,
It's
don't know it.
by, oh God, I keep forgetting the name because it's one of those like really basic American names. I want to call him Frank Miller, but I don't think it's Frank Miller. Something Junior. It's old and it's interesting for a couple of reasons. It's a science fiction classic. It's basically three sort of like novellas that are sort of stitched together into like one larger novel, and it's in the far future, after a nuclear holocaust, and everyone is basically dead, and there's these monks, the monks of Saint Leibowitz, who collect knowledge, and they basically just like store knowledge in their monastery, and then they discover something, and then the next step there, the world is basically back from like full-on post-apocalypse to a sort of like medieval early Renaissance kind of world, and then the third one is high tech, at the brink of yet another nuclear war, and it's just interesting. It has a very sort of dark, sardonic humor in it that is incredibly depressing and also very funny. And what's interesting about it is that the author, whose name I keep forgetting, was a pilot. He was a bomber pilot in World War II,
Okay.
and he was part of the bomber squad that bombed the monastery of Monte Cassino, which, if you don't know, was the original monastery of Saint Benedict, where the Benedictine order started. And the Nazis held up in it, and there was a big battle about it. And at some point, they bombed the entire monastery, which is, one of the founding biggest monasteries in Western Christianity ever. And he came back to Italy afterwards and looked at like what he had done, basically by bombing away that monastery, and it absolutely wrecked him in a lot of ways. And he dealt with having done that for the rest of his life. And Canticle for Leibowitz is partly sort of informed by him having trying to come to terms with the fact that, for a good reason, he had to destroy something incredibly powerful, beautiful, meaningful for what you might call Western civilization. And in that regard, it's like a very, very moving book, and it's also just like
Yeah.
very funny. And then near the end, it gets like really dark because it talks about euthanasia and how Catholic priests can't allow that and have to sort of figure out how to deal with the fact that you have a lot of people that have gotten radiation poisoning and would probably be better off if they could, um, choose a painless way out of their lives instead of just suffering for like a couple of weeks longer. And the fact that he's willing to sort of tackle that from the perspective of a Catholic priest who has to deal with that and tries to come to terms with that is, it's pretty heavy stuff for a science fiction
Yeah.
novel from the 1950s. Who calls Tolkien a fascist? And don't say Michael Moorcock, because he doesn't. He's very clear about that. Yeah, but I have very conflicted thoughts on Tolkien and Tolkien's politics, but Tolkien called himself an anarchist. I'll just say that. So, oh yeah, it's Walter M. Miller. That's the name, Walter M. Miller Jr. That's the
Right, you
author of
weren't
like Quantical
that far
for
off.
Leibowitz. Yeah, but as I said, one of those really basic American names that are so difficult to remember because he's Joe Anybody, I guess. No, it's a wonderful book, and it's one of those early science fiction novels that really goes deep. When you have like a couple of these authors that were Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five is another one of those like authors that actually fought in World War II and sort of try to use their fiction afterwards to come to terms with what they witnessed and what they did. And I think that's yeah, it can be very touching. And Slaughterhouse-Five is another one that I thought was like really, really moving and depressing as hell. Have you read that?
No, I have yet to read the big classics, as I could refer to them, which is like Slaughterhouse-Five, 1984, Brave New World. They have escaped me.
Yeah. I mean, the good part about some of these older classics is they're all relatively short. I thought like as a book, 1984 is actually not that good. Now Britain will be really mad at me. I mean, it's powerful in its message, and you can feel how angry Orwell was. Which Orwell was always a very angry man, so it kind of tracks. I've read better written books. Is my point. Like it's very much about the message and not so much about the plot in a lot of ways, and not so much about the prose and not so much about the characters. And
Yeah, not so much about the prose is fine by me. I don't mind like language as a tool. Uh, I'm more likely to be like off-put by prose than to really like mind a simple prose, for example.
I think it always depends. Like I am sort of vain enough to enjoy beautifully crafted language. I'm like, wow, this is. I just like read this sentence and I'm like, this is just beautiful. I just want to. I would just want to just lean back and just enjoy how beautiful these words are, and I can do that. But then I can also go and go like, well, this is just very effective and it does the job, and I'm good with that.
I think for me, what I like is like a really good chosen language. Like you can read a sentence and be like, okay,
Yeah.
these are the exact correct words to use.
Yeah.
What I mind is like feeling like they're using 20 words to say something that you can say in 5 words. Let's say it like that, where I feel like
Yeah.
it's overwritten and it's just like droning on. Then I
Yeah.
much prefer simpler prose that uses less
Yeah.
words. But what I like is like just using the exact amount of words you need and the exact right words.
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the strengths of Glenn Cook, that fantasy author that way too few people read and think he's simple in a lot of ways, which he's not. And he has this sentence at the beginning of the first Black Company book, and they're like, it's first person narrative of like a bunch of mercenaries, and they're at that point in service to like this very corrupt sort of Roman style, emperor style, dictator guy, and he just like the coin was good, but not in the pay was good, but not in coin of the soul. And I'm like, yeah, that's one sentence. I know exactly what you want to tell me. And you could have used a paragraph to explain how it's destroying the entire company's morals to do evil for money and shit. Use just like 5 words, and I'm good.
Yeah, indeed, that's what I like. That type of writing.
Yeah. Yes. Also, I agree. Slaughterhouse-Five is a very good book, and it's really short and weird and broken and fractured, and which is kind of the point, because coming through the bombing of Dresden is certainly not going to leave you a very stable person afterwards, and it's insane how clever and sane Kurt Vonnegut was afterwards. In any case. Oh, Animal Farm. It's been ages since I read that. I read that in school, obviously. Like, it's one of those books, like one of the few sort of science fiction-y, fantasy-ish books that that you get to read in in English class in Germany.
Yeah, we didn't read it actually, but I have read it. I read it later, and I really enjoyed it as well. But it was like one of the missed points in my education, I guess. But we went for others. I don't think we have like I don't think we read any sort of like great classic of like English speaking literature. We went for like Blindness by Jose Saramago, for example, and The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. So we read like Portuguese language book for some reason.
Okay, that's weird. Yeah. Like, I mean, we don't. I think there's sort of like this weird canon where it's like at some point in English class you have to read at least a couple of paragraphs of Shakespeare. There's no way around that, and stuff like that. And I got to read Animal Farm, and I got to read Brave New World. And here's a funny anecdote about like the Brave New World thing. Um, a bunch of people didn't want to read it in English, so they got like a German edition. And there's an older German edition they had in the school library still at the time, so they checked it out from the school library. And the older German edition switches the setting from London to Berlin for some reason,
Mm.
and changes names into German names. And when they then had to write the exam at school, they all used like the German names and stuff because they didn't think about the fact that it may have been changed in translation. So the teacher was like, "Well, I could tell who read the English book, and I could tell who was lazy and got the German edition because of you guys."
Yeah, I did a similar thing actually when I was a teacher. So my kids had to read The Witches by Roald Dahl, and
Okay.
that book has a very different ending than the movie version does. And so, based off of people's review for it, I also knew who had just watched the movie and who had actually read the book.
Yeah, I like because I was a terribly annoying kid in school, and we had this project where everyone could pick a book and present that book in English class, and a 15-year-old me decided to go for Clockwork Orange.
Sure.
Which I'm very thankful to my English teacher to actually go through with that. To say, if you want to do that, that's you. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do this. And I read it in English, which is quite the challenge for a 15-year-old. I'm just saying, like non-English speaker, because it's a very unique style that he uses, and I probably didn't pick up on all the nuances, but yeah.
Well, they were probably happy to have somebody read something like that.
The Alchemist, I have never read. The thing is with The Alchemist, you know how books are sometimes marketed in waves, and when The Name of the Rose came out and became a huge hit in Germany, everything that sort of could be slightly moved into sort of historical stuff and whatnot all got the same cover design that The Name of the Rose had at the time. And I never picked up any of those books, and some of them may have been like really good. I don't know. But The Alchemist had a cover design that looked like Name of the Rose, and now it's just like another knockoff medieval fantasy book, a medieval history book, historical fiction. And I'm probably really wrong about that, but it's sort of like
Yes.
when marketing can go wrong.
It's absolutely not that. But I would also think that it's probably not for you. It's also not for me anymore. I reread it and I was like, oh, okay, I don't actually like this book anymore. But it was good for me at the age of 17 because it is kind of like inspirational sort of stuff.
Yeah. At the age of 17, I read Conan the Barbarian stories. They're also very inspirational and aspirational in a lot of ways. I'm glad I'm over that though.
Could make that a new thing on our channel, rereading Conan the Barbarian.
It's one of the earliest videos I made on my channel. I actually got a comment on
Ah.
it last night or yesterday. Someone going like, "Wow, great analysis," and I'm like, "No, no." So here's the thing: I still really enjoy. Maybe enjoy is the wrong word. Like, I get a lot of value out of reading Robert E. Howard still, and I've reread them regularly, like a couple of like 2 or 3 years ago, the last time, and they are valuable in a lot of ways. But they are easy to sort of misread as a 17-year-old because Robert E. Howard was obviously one of the most influential writers in fantasy ever, though he's not as acknowledged as, say, Tolkien. But he was also like the archetype for an incel in a lot of ways, and you can see that. Like he had one one semi-serious relationship in his entire life that never got anywhere because he's just too stuck up in himself. And then he took care of his mother when she was sick and so forth. And when his mother passed away, he just killed himself. He's a very, very, very tortured person, and you can read that in his stories. It kind of comes through, and while they are obviously in a lot of ways like mass-produced pulp stories for pulp magazines, there is sort of an anguish in there and a rage in there that is missing in a lot of his sort of contemporaries that make them sort of like hit hard in a lot of ways. But if you're like 17 and you're maybe not very happy with yourself, reading about Conan the Barbarian being Conan the Barbarian can certainly get you into like a very specific toxic part of masculinity if you're not careful.
Yeah.
But in that regard, I think they are like absolutely valuable to read because there is something in there. It's what happens if an autodidact reads Nietzsche and kind of gets it wrong. I disagree with you, Britton, on the ending of A Clockwork Orange. I think the book ending is, in fact, better. Because it looks at, like, forms of redemption and if there is a chance of actually getting better or not. And A Clockwork Orange, the movie leaves that out. Have you read the book, Clio?
Nope. I'm sorry. Not even, because I wanted to read the book, but I for some reason I always put it on like in sort of like the same wheelbarrow as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, even though the only link there is that they're like cult movies, I guess. But
yeah, they are different in a lot of ways. The interesting thing is that A Clockwork Orange was published in the UK. And then it was published in the US, and the US publisher cut the last chapter. So the US version of the book didn't have the last chapter for a long time. When Stanley Kubrick made the movie, he based it on the US version. So the movie also ends without that last. It's basically like Lord of the Rings. and that there's a lot of people who don't know
the real ending. Yeah.
Don't know how the book actually ends.
But that apparently also happens with like the translation of one of Murakami's novels, for example, of Wind Up Bird Chronicle. It says in the Dutch edition that the English edition is missing part of the ends.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yes, I haven't looked into it.
Did they do like a second translation, newer translation or something? Because I recently had that one because I don't speak French well enough to read books in French, so I got the English edition of The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. And there's a new translation from like 2 or 3 years ago, and that's the first complete translation because the older translation just dropped out some entire chapters because they thought like no one wants to read those chapters. And a translation is super fascinating. I guess we can talk a bit more about that because you read a lot of like translated fiction and read fiction in different languages. What I found interesting with The Second Sex is in English, it's The Second Sex, right? And in French, it's Le Deuxième Sexe, which both make sense. The German translation is Das andere Geschlecht, which means the other sex. And just by switching that word in the title, it already completely shifts the meaning of what this is about, because it erases sort of like the hierarchy thing that is clearly intended there, right?
Yeah. I mean, to be fair to translators, it's very difficult, of course, but indeed, there's a balance and a nuance in language that can go lost in translation, and that's really fascinating to look at, the way that our languages, not just when it comes to translations, but the way that they kind of shape our thinking as well. I always thought that those were like the most interesting things that we discussed when we were like when we were like studying languages, the way in which a language kind of shapes your thinking and the way that your world shapes your language.
I found that really interesting. When they translated A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James, which is, mostly written in different levels of Jamaican patois and some classic English, traditional English as well. For the Spanish translation, they got 2 translators. They got one for Castilian Spanish and one for Cuban Spanish to reflect those different layers of Spanish, which I found like thought was like a really, really clever way of doing that, because you can't sort of completely divest language of the cultural background and surrounding of it in a lot of ways. And if you want to, reflect part of that colonial experience that is baked into the patois kind of thing, having someone with a Castilian Spanish, continental Spanish background trying to translate that does not work in the same way that having someone with a Cuban Spanish background doing that. But I thought it was like a really clever way of doing it.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds like an amazing translation and amazing translation project. To have
Yeah,
it be like together, to have two translators for it who have to also probably work in tandem to some extent.
yeah. I don't know if you told that story, Peter, but it sounds very much like an experience that a lot of people in on BookTube have had. I certainly have read Lord of the Rings instead of assigned books before. Well, also, I think like 16 is a good age to start watching A Clockwork Orange, because it's edgy in a lot of ways. There's even like a German. It started out as a punk band. Now they're just like a sort of punkish rock band for old people. They did like a concept album on A Clockwork Orange when they were like young and angry. It's a very much a cult kind of thing. Well, that's good for your teacher. Like, I mean, really cool for of your teacher to let you pass. But if you go like, well, I didn't read the Dutch book. I read Lord of the Rings instead. The Blair Witch Project 2. I watched one and I was like, yeah, I see what you're doing there. This is impressive. But I hate you for all the found footage movies that came after that. Yeah, Robert E. Howard was certainly an interesting man. There's a really good book by um, that woman he almost dated or didn't date or whatever. He then married one of his pen friends, because they, all pen pals. And I keep forgetting her first name. She's something Novelyn Price, and she wrote a novel, or not a novel, like sort of like a memoir about her time trying to deal with Robert E. Howard. It's called the Whole Wide World, I think. I think it's called The Whole Wide World. It was made into a movie, and the movie has a different title, and I always confuse those two. But if you can get a hold of that book, I highly recommend reading that, because it's really interesting. It's based on her diary entries from the time when she was trying to start a relationship with with a really, really fucked up person, like mentally fucked up person. Like he never did like anything condemnable in that regard, but he was just like a very broken human. And it's just interesting to see that sort of like from her perspective. She was a school teacher at the time, so like for 1930s Texas, a fairly independent and fairly modern woman, and he was very much a yeah an incel, basically. He's a proto incel in a lot of ways, and having her perspective is just both fascinating but also incredibly depressing in a lot of ways, and seeing like how someone just like never had a chance to actually survive in the world because of like all the circumstances around that. I think Howard read Nietzsche also. I'm not quite sure. Liam is not here, unfortunately. But there's like tons of like, there's like 5 volumes of like his correspondence with H.P. Lovecraft and all these other people. The fuck. Sorry. And there's like 5 volumes of like his correspondence. That's one of the things that I find so interesting about the pulp era, whether you like the audio, the authors or not, is a lot of them wrote a lot of letters to each other, and they're all sort of, they have been published and edited and so forth. So you have a large group of authors writing fantasy and science fiction and talking about their craft and all the other stuff in those letters, so you can analyze what they think about what they're doing and so forth. And it's, from like a scholarly perspective, that's really impressive, interesting to dig into, because how often do you get like writers talking about what they're doing? But like, do you specifically? That's like something I don't want to talk over you all the time, so I'm sorry about that. Do you specifically seek out like translated fiction or fiction from from authors from different cultural backgrounds and different languages, or is this just something that has happened because of your studies and so forth? And like, what did you actually study though?
So I studied English, Spanish, so literature, language. I did a year of Chinese before that, so that's where my basics in Chinese come from. But then it turned out that, like, if I wanted to succeed for my second year of Chinese, I would have to actually put some effort into it. And then I was like, yeah, I'm out. So I went for English, Spanish instead. But do I specifically seek it out? Good question. Like, I do, like, occasionally I do like keep an eye out for translated literature and have an interest in what is coming out in it. But it's also just kind of come from having read authors from different nationalities
Mm,
kind of always, like, not always of course, but kind of since high school already. As I said, we were reading like Blindness and The Alchemist when I was still in high school, and
yeah.
so it was kind of a normal thing to be reading from different cultures and different languages, and I have always wanted to continue doing that. um, Especially since wasn't really attracted to like Flemish literature, for example. And to be
Yeah.
fair, I should still give that a go now, because that's kind of just like the examples that we were having when we were in high school weren't really selling me. But maybe if I were to choose stuff myself nowadays, it would work much better. And the perfume we also read in high school, for example. So that was
I
then
had to read that in school and I hated it.
I also hated it.
Yes, I'm not alone.
It's the one thing that makes me wonder, like, would this be a book for me now? Because it kind of sounds like I would like this, but I only remember that I absolutely hated it.
I think like my issue that back then, and I was like a very arrogant, smart ass in high school, right? I still am. um, my impression back then was that the perfume is trying to do the sort of like smart postmodern thing, but it's not succeeding. It's like, hey, I gotta, be all over the place. I gotta be more provocative than I can be in movies or whatever, and can do all these things, and it just never adds up. And at the end of the day, it's just like, yeah, you've told me this story about, yeah, smell, and there's symbolism in there. I get it, but it's also heavy-handed in a lot of ways. And it felt heavy-handed, I think, is my point.
Yeah, I don't really have any memories of my experience with it. I just remember hating it and a lot of my
Mm.
friends really liking it, which made me hate it even more, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the things like my former flatmate, who also he was like 2 years ahead of me in school, and we moved in together afterwards when I was at university, and he wasn't at university. And it's like, and he also loved it. It's like, oh, we read it in high school as well, and we loved it. It was so good. It's like, no, it's it's not. It's just not. But that's like another thing that I find really interesting. And I'd like to hear your take on that. It's like, do you have this because you read a lot of like translated fiction, you read a lot of English authors, American authors, whatever. When we talk about books on booktube, we mostly talk about international authors. Do you feel that like your, in this case, Belgian authors, in this case probably Dutch language authors, do you feel sort of like dismissive of those kind of people? Because I feel sometimes dismissive of like German authors. And like obviously German fantasy is not very good in a lot of cases. But I noticed this recently when I read Foucault's Pendulum, and I've wanted to read it for a long ass time, and there wasn't like an unabridged audiobook. And then finally they made one in German, and I'm going to wait for the English translation. But why am I waiting for an English translation if I can get it in German? It's like, both are translated from the Italian. I won't read the original anyway. So why am I being dismissive of my own language in this case, my own
Yeah.
like first language? And do you feel that this is something that, say, being on YouTube, where the medium is an English language medium, sort of like drives into our brains in a way? Or is that just me being me?
I don't know. It's difficult for me to say because I have that same sort of thing, but it's also fueled by the difference between the Dutch from the Netherlands and the Dutch from Belgium.
Yeah.
And so I will not be going into a Dutch translation because a Dutch translation is like written more towards the Dutch from the Netherlands audience, and that will just drive me crazy. And that's also my problem with a lot of Flemish authors is that a lot of the market is towards Dutch from the Netherlands, and so they'll also be told to write more towards that type of language. So I cannot fully distinguish whether it's a case of me being like, English is the language that we're using, and so um, it's the fact that I'm part of an
Mhm.
English speaking community that is driving
Mhm.
these things upon me,
Yeah.
or whether it's just the nature of like Dutch translation.
But are
But
you really?
I
Yeah.
will say indeed that I have read the new what is her name? The author of Tenders, the new Agostina Basterica, so the author of
Mhm.
Tender is the Flesh.
Yeah.
I did read that in Spanish, and it wasn't out yet in English, and that was a problem for me to kind of be like, I'm going to read that, because then I was like, yeah, but my subscribers won't be able to read it.
Yeah. Here's a video for my 5 Spanish-speaking subscribers.
So it does come into play in that
Mhm.
regard. And so I do think that there is some sort of a tendency to be more likely to read in English as a
Mhm.
consequence of doing your videos in English. But for me, it's difficult
Yeah.
to talk about it because I'm like, yeah, but I also just,
Mhm.
every experience I've had with something translated into Dutch has been a bad experience.
Yeah. I, I just like noticed it when with that Umberto Eco example, because there it's so ridiculous, because I've read essays by Eco where he talks about translation, and because Eco spoke German, and I know that he did in fact consult with his translators on the translation, argue with them over words to get it right. And it's like, why do I feel the German one is less good than the English one? It doesn't make any
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
sense.
But I feel you. I definitely do have it to some extent because sometimes I'm like, this is a book originally written in German. It's probably going to be better in the Dutch translation than it is in the English translation because the language is
Yeah,
so much closer. But still, I will be more inclined to read the English. So yeah, I do have it to some extent.
yeah. I mean, I will say I did pick 100 Years of Solitude in English and not in German in translation. I could have picked both, right? Like, obviously, I don't speak Spanish, so I had to pick a translation. I picked the English one because I'm like, if I'm going to talk about it on a video, it'll be easier for me to make a video in English if I've read the thing in English, because then I don't have to
Mhm.
do like brain translation from like the German text in my head to
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
speaking in English. So there's a
Yeah,
pragmatic aspect to that as well.
that was a whole thing for the Agostina Basterica book because I was like,
I can
right,
imagine.
how am I going to call these things? I do think that I call them the unworthy, and this book is now going to get published in November or something like that, and it is
Okay.
called the unworthy, and I'm like, yes.
Yes. I still have to read Tender as the Flesh. I mean, I feel like everyone loves it, so or at least goes like, well, it's one of those books you can't sort of like forget easily.
Yeah, it's definitely memorable. And I think a lot of people, not everybody loves it. There are definitely people who don't like it, and there are people who raise objections that I felt were a little bit unfair towards it, or where I was like, yeah, but no, this is in the book, or
Yeah,
saying like, I don't understand why they didn't do this or that, and I said like, yeah, okay, it's not spelled out, but it's kind of implied within the book
yeah.
why they don't just go for this other option.
Um, okay, Ori, I'll trust you on that. I have never heard of her, so
Oh
but
no, me
I'm
neither.
obviously someone who knows nothing about about Latin American authors in general. But
Another really
if
good
Ursula Le
one is
Guin was a fan, I assume it's good.
another really good Latin American author. I'm not entirely sure. I think she's from Chile. Is Claudia Pinheiro, but so this is also more like litfic. But she has like a book about a woman with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's.
Okay.
I'm not entirely sure now anymore. Parkinson's, I think, who kind of has to go and find like the killer of her daughter or something like that. But it's really well, like I really enjoyed that book a whole ton.
Okay, that sounds interesting. Yeah, Peter, like here, like English books are cheaper as well because English books are not. In Germany, we have this really weird thing which is called Buchpreisbindung, which, which is one of those typical German words where you take like three words and just like slam them together, and now it's a new word, which
Yeah.
means that like German books printed in Germany, like in the German language, can only be sold in Germany at the same price at every store. So you can't discount them
Okay.
at all, which is on the one hand sort of like helps smaller bookstores because they can't be sort of like outbid by big stores. Like even Amazon has to adhere to that in Germany. So German language books are all sold at the same price everywhere. So you can just go to your local store and you will, you don't have to go to like a big store to get like a cheaper deal or whatever, which is a good thing in that idea. English books are not part of that. So you can discount English books as much as you want, which is why English books are often cheaper than German ones because, yeah, capitalism, which is bad. But in this case, I can benefit from it.
Sure, but like, are they also not still more expensive in Germany since Brexit?
Well, if they're from the UK, then yes. English language books in general, not so much British, like printed in the UK stuff, then yes, I guess. I have not heard about that one, Britain. I know nothing about smart books. I'm only reading weird shit.
Yeah, Our Share of Night is also one that's like on my endless
Okay.
one to read list.
Yeah, those never end.
Yeah.
Well, if Kelly Link is also a fan, then I guess I have to put it on my list because Kelly Link also knows what she's talking about. I didn't know that Le Guin could translate Spanish to English. That's interesting. Well, I'm learning a lot here today. um, so you studied English Spanish to become a teacher, and then you did something else, or how did that come about?
I didn't study to become a teacher. I rejected the idea of becoming a teacher, but then I was like, the easiest path is actually becoming a teacher. So I just basically, like in high school, I did science and maths. And
Yeah.
then when I had to choose what I was going to do after high school, I was like, I am open to anything that isn't science or math. And then it just like, I think in the fifth year or something like that, we had like um, a section about the Cultural Revolution in China that we saw in history class. And that
Hmm.
just really fascinated me. And I was just like, this is something completely different from anything that we have seen.
Yeah.
And so that's where my decision came to study Chinese. I was like, I want something completely different. But then I kind of started missing the English when I was doing the Chinese. But so yeah, I basically
What you're
after
saying is Mao got you into university.
I have a few things to thank Mao for. That is one of them. The other thing is the simplification of the Chinese language, which every student
Makes
of
it easier to
Chinese,
actually study it.
yes, every student of Chinese has to be very grateful to Chairman Mao. Yes.
See, if you ever get like another cat, you can call that cat Chairman Meow.
That is a possibility. I have to write that down.
Uh, that's just interesting. Like that you studied like languages and like switched from Chinese to Spanish and English, and then ended up not becoming a teacher full time.
Yeah, I did. Like, I was a teacher for 2 years, and I hated most of it. So, but I was
Yeah.
still going to continue if it weren't for like a panic attack that I had like on the 1st of September, God knows how many years ago. And then I went to the doctor, and he was like, "But do you actually want to be a teacher?" And then I had like a breakdown because I felt like it was a failure not to
Mm.
continue it. Whereas it was like, yeah, I wasn't enjoying it. So, like, yeah. Wasn't
Yeah.
failure, but it's just like how the stupid brain works sometimes.
Yeah, when I started studying, right, I started studying math and philosophy on a teaching degree, and then I decided to not do that because I figured out, like, nah, teaching with kids is probably not what I'm good at. Or maybe I'm good at teaching or explaining stuff, but I'm probably not good at like the human stuff that also kind of
Mhm.
comes with that. And that's like one of those things that I kind of get overlooked a lot of times. Like I have friends who studied teaching and started teaching, and some of them are really struggling because no one prepares you for like all the human stuff that you also need to do. And it's like, yeah, I can explain shit.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean I'm able to deal with the fact that like half of the people that I'm talking to are humans that are coming from broken homes and have all these other human needs. And suddenly I'm the person who has to sort of do that and also not do that because it's my job to not do that because there's restrictions and shit. And yeah, that's the reasons why so many teachers are alcoholics, I guess.
Yeah, I think in my case, so I studied languages, and then
Mm,
basically, if you wanted to become a teacher, you did like one extra year. But
yeah,
in that extra year was only about like how do you teach somebody languages and like the current philosophy on teaching languages to people,
yeah,
but nothing about like how do you take control of a classroom, how do
yeah.
you keep people engaged and stuff like that.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's super interesting. Like we had that. So if you go for like high school teaching, you only get
Yeah.
didactics. You get taught didactics, and that's it. I have a friend who took a teaching degree for God, words, schools for people with learning disabilities, basically. And she got like a lot of like additional classes on like how to deal with like the human aspect of having people with special needs and shit, right? She got taught all the stuff that other teachers should probably also get taught, but we just assume that high school kids are machines that we can just like feed learning into, and I'm like, that's not how that works.
Yeah, I mean, if that was how it works, then I might have still been a teacher because I did enjoy like teaching people
Yeah,
stuff, but I didn't enjoy the whole getting their attention, keeping their
yeah,
attention, that all sort of stuff, or like being consequent about taking action when somebody does something that's not okay in your classroom and stuff like that. I hated all of that. So
yeah. Yeah, I can see that. It's like, so I decided early on that I'm probably not a good teacher, right? It's like the same reason why I don't have like a. People always ask me like, "You're blind. Why don't you have like a guide dog?" And I'm like, "Because you have to be strict with guide dogs, and I can't do that. If I have a guide dog, we'll just like go to the first fucking bratwurst stand, and that's where we'll stay for the rest of our lives. It's just not gonna work."
but that dog will be living his best life.
Oh yeah, I had a dog. It was just like a regular dog. It
Yeah.
still worked for that specific thing, right? Like I live up here on like what I fancifully call the Lonely Mountain, and it's a bit outside of town, so it didn't have a store for the longest time. Now it does have a grocery store. It's a very small one, but there's like a bunch of like larger like factories and bigger companies out here. So we have this like bakery and this butcher's shop like trout like cart that comes by in the morning to basically just like sell like lunch to workers.
Yeah.
And my dog was incredibly good at timing to want to go outside exactly when that cart came by and to pick up something to eat there. And I'm like, it was really funny. I was writing my thesis at the time in computer science. So I was sitting at home and writing. So it was fine for me to go out at like, I don't know, 11 to pick up food for me and the dog. But it was still very interesting. So I don't need a guide dog. The things I need a dog for, every dog can provide. Oh yeah, why have you named your cats Buffy and Fate?
Oh, because I'm a huge fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, of course. So,
Yeah, that makes sense.
so yeah, that's really the only reason. But I have a list of like potential cat names for future cats in case I ever need it. But Chairman Meow can definitely be added to that list.
My friends, they have. I recently met them back when I was in Bulgaria, and um, he did his PhD in mercenaries and pirates in the Baltics in the early modern era, because historian with interesting topics. And they have a cat now, and they named her cat. They named their cat Claus Sturtebaker. Well, they spell Claus with as
Yeah.
claws, right? It's also like the laziest, largest, fattest black cat I've ever met. And that's like pet names are so funny in that regard. Like a friend of mine, we wanted to adopt a dog, and luckily it was already gone at that point. It was like an Afghan dog, and he was named Cambyses II. And we were like, we know all the ancient history people in Marburg. We should be aware of who actually named that dog, because there's 10 people in this town who know who Cambyses II is. One of them has to be the culprit here.
Yeah, my cats were called originally Pim and Pom before I adopted them, but I was like, no way am I taking those names.
Pim and Pom, yeah. Yeah, that's bad. I mean, no self-respecting cat would want to be called Pim or a Pom.
Yeah, apparently it's like it's from a children's book apparently. So it's
Yeah.
Annie M. G. Schmidt apparently has two cats in her books called Pim and Pom, and they are indeed a tiger cat and a black cat. So I
Okay, that makes
understand,
sense.
but since I didn't read that, I just was like, I can never remember who is Pim and who is Pom, so we are not gonna do this.
Yeah. My mom's cats, she always has like a red, like ginger cats, and they're all massive assholes.
As they are, yeah.
Yeah. Ginger tomcats, all terrible, terrible cats. And the first one was called Tarzan, and the current one that she has is called Hagar.
Yeah, my sister also has a ginger cat, and it is indeed a little bit of an asshole.
Yeah, it's kind of part of those kind of cats. I don't know why.
Yeah, well,
It's like
me neither.
even when the current cat was like super small, he was like a small kitten, and he was like, there's a picture of like him hanging onto my arm, like hanging with claws down and just still biting me in the hand, and like this is not going to be a very small, very kind cat. I can tell you that. He's also massively overweight.
Right, mine were, but I think that they're on a good weight now.
It
I had
always
to
drives
get
my sister mad when she comes over to visit my mother, which hasn't happened as often when she still lived in Israel. She's now moving back to Germany, and it's always she's like, "This cat is way too fat." And my mother, no, he only weighs this. And says, no, this cat is too fat. I'm a veterinarian. I know these things. Trust me, this cat is overweight.
Yeah, I have a colleague like that as well who has like a giant cat, and he's
Yeah.
also like, according to him, he went to the vet with the cat, and the vet told him that the cat is normal weight, and I'm like, no, it's not possible. It's like the same size of my cat, and it's a long-haired cat like my cat, and it's like twice the weight of mine.
Yeah, this is too much. Yes, Britton, I will listen to the Eden audiobook. I will do that. I don't know if I will make a video on it though, because I feel weird about making a video about a book by another booktuber whom I've had like very friendly contact with before, and I'm like, what if I don't like it? Should I go through all the things that piss me off about it? And I'm pretty sure there will be stuff that pisses me off, because it's me. I'll always find something that annoys me. I'm good at that. It's one of my few skills. It's like finding stuff that makes me angry. So I'm not sure if I'll make like a review thing or something, or maybe I'll just like ask Philip on if he wants to come over to have a conversation about it, and then I'll just like have this long list, just like get myself like a wig and like a hammer and go like, all right, we have a conversation. Deposition now.
Exhibit A.
Hey, I have Bernardo Gui's Inquisitor handbook lying around somewhere. Did you know that he wrote one? Like
No.
Bernard Gui, the evil inquisitor from Name of the Rose, did actually exist. He's a historical fake person, and he wrote a handbook for inquisitors, and it's actually really interesting and good. Like
Well, that it's interesting, I can imagine.
the thing is, and that's one of those things that you only know when you study his medieval history and don't just read Umberto Eco's books as if they were actual history, which they're not. Bernard Gui did do a lot of like inquisitorial cases, but he like rarely sentenced anyone to death, and of those like final sentences, only a fraction did actually get carried out. So he could, like, I don't know, I have to look it up again because I don't know the numbers by now, but it's in the very low two digits. Like 15 or 20 people got actually killed out of like over 1,000 cases that he judged. So his image in Name of the Rose is very very different from the reality, and the book is just interesting because he explains very much like how to sort of like how to interview like a suspect, what to ask, what kind of answers could be sort of like in a hint that they are specifically fall into this specific heresy and something like that. There's like actual forms and stuff in that book where he
Okay.
goes like, you have to ask this question and this question and this question, and then you can go do this stuff, and it's just like really interesting to see how he tries to formalize like a process to make sure that people actually do justice and not just like go vibes. This cat seems to be angry about the
Yeah,
Inquisition.
it's her typical state of mind. She's very chatty. This is her
That's good.
kind meow. She has a very annoying meow as well, which I hear more often.
Have you read Terry Pratchett's books about a book about cats?
No, I have not read any Terry Pratchett's.
So here's the thing: it's like he has a bunch of novels where cats show up, obviously, because he was a big cat lover. But he also has a book just about owning cats and how cats behave and stuff. That's I guess you could call it nonfiction. It's really funny because he's very good at describing cat nature. I think it's called The Common House Cat or something like that. It's really funny.
Okay. Yeah, I have a few cat books that are like
Mm.
on my toilet. Could add that one.
Good night, Peter. Thanks for checking in. Um, yeah, so that's like one of those things. Like, do you like accept arcs, and do you accept like books from other booktubers and friends and whatnot when they offer you books for your reviews, or is that something you just don't do in general? Because I'm trying to figure out what to do now that apparently Simon and Schuster wants to send me romantasy books.
Oh. Well, maybe it's a niche genre that you have to discover that will actually work for you. I
I
was
don't know.
actually
I was just
surprised.
surprised.
Well, I
Yeah,
was
but you go
also
ahead.
surprised because I read my first, I think, romantasy, though I feel like a lot of YA fantasy in the time was
Mm,
kind of what romantasy is now. And I was immediately sucked in and have been devouring this series, even though I thought that romantasy was not going to be for me at all. Turns out it is. But yeah, in terms of arcs, I mean, I don't actually get offered arcs, but I do have like
mm.
the NetGalley profile, and then I sometimes
Ah.
request stuff on there, and then if I get that, then I review them. But I'm always way behind on the deadline, so I also still have to
Mm.
read Navola, even though it's already published in the meantime.
Ooh, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think about it because I really loved it. I think it's really good. It's also really funny and interesting and has a lot of very explicit sex scenes. Well, not that many explicit sex scenes, but people are constantly talking about genitals.
Okay, it's not what I'm looking forward to in the book, but okay.
I, I think it makes sense. And, I reread the Decameron right after that. And it makes sense if he's talking about if your world is built around like the 14th century, basically Florence kind of thing. Sexuality was very different in that time. It's like there's not that much like explicit erotica in it, but like people are constantly talking about dicks and stuff. in interesting metaphors, which is the other part there. And it's like, yeah, I guess that was just like part of the culture. And if you want to sort of like invoke that in your fantasy, then evoke, not invoke, evoke that in your fantasy, you kind of need to sort of find a way to do that.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, so I haven't read any romantasy, and I'm not sure if I want to, but I feel I'm old enough and maybe sometimes self-aware enough to understand that a lot of the reasons why I don't enjoy romantasy is based in insecurity, right? Like I'm a dude who grew up in the 90s. I'm very much boys don't cry, no feelings, no whatsoever. So romance is not something I will even let close to my heart. So reading a romantasy kind of book feels like it's probably like not liking it or having these like sort of like weird reflex of like even hearing about romantasy is rooted in insecurity for me. I'm pretty sure that's what it is, but I'm not sure if I can sort of overcome that though. Because maybe I'm too old for that.
I also think that it kind of really depends on what you read, because I also had this sort of image in my mind of what romantasy was going to be like, and then the series that I'm currently reading is like, it's not always different from what I expect it to be.
Mhm.
But for example, in the first book, the love interest is only there in like the final 10% of the book or something like that. So
Yeah.
very much unlike what I'd expected it to be. And I think in the last book that I've read in the series now, they don't
Mhm.
actually are in the same space at any point in
Yeah.
time in the book.
I'm just like, if you tell me this is like a romantasy, so on and so forth, with a lover romance, I'm like, I don't want to know that in advance, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of like the thing that I know that's important for like a lot of romance readers. They kind of want to know what's sort of like what specific type of romance they're getting and stuff like that. But it's like, I don't want to know this in advance. It's like, I'd rather, I'm not like against like romance in books. Don't get me wrong; it's totally fine. I have claimed that the entire series of the Black Company is in fact a love story. Um, I just it's like a very different language. Like the whole like
Yeah.
romance and romanticism genre I'm standing in front of them like you're doing something very different from like what I do in books. It's like you're reading books differently, you're writing books differently from anything I read.
Yeah. But I also normally don't really like all that much romance in my fantasy books, even though a ton of what I pick up has romance in it, which
Yeah,
is pretty central. But I tend to prefer it to not be there. But then sometimes something like this absolutely works, and I read
yeah,
1,800 pages in a day, and I'm like, what?
yeah. Which is why everyone should read Blackheart Man because it does have romance in it, and it's polyamorous romance because we're doing really interesting things in that book.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. It's currently I'm obsessed with the book, and no one's. I mean, Shadia is reading it, and hope she's enjoying it. But I think what's so fascinating with that book is that like I feel a lot of the people that do classic fantasy booktube would really enjoy that book if they would actually give it a try because it does do a lot of classic fantasies things in a lot of ways. But it kind of twists them all in a lot of in interesting new directions. And yes, part of that is that everyone is sort of polyamorous in that island, which is just like part of how that works. You have like two co-husbands and a wife, and that's just like how that is. Which was interesting for me to read, and I'm like, oh wow, this is interesting. I've never thought about that whole concept, so I'm happy to learn about it. But yeah, we'll see if anyone else picks it up. But I'm not very hopeful. But then when I read Romanticy's next phenomenon, I guess I become a big booktuber now. That was
Yeah,
a surprise
I'm
because
not
like
yet ready for the Fort Wing experience.
I don't know. Maybe it's good. I just feel
Maybe.
like I mean, obviously, there's people who I respect a lot who like it, and I'm like, yeah, clearly it works for people, and that's fine. I just don't feel like reading books where I'm clearly not the target audience and then go like, okay, I hated this book because I'm like, yeah, but
Yeah.
you're a middle-aged white dude. You're not supposed to like horny dragons. That's not your genre. So me telling everyone that I didn't like Fourth Wing would not be. I mean, apparently it would be content, but I don't think it would be good content. Is that it? But it's like something that you do, like when you select books that you go like, clearly this is not written for me, and then you just like pass it by, or is it something you don't think about?
Um, no, I don't think I really think about that much.
Yeah, that's interesting because like I feel like and that might just be like something of the last couple of years, but it feels like more and more books are written towards a specific audience and marketed towards a specific audience. Where I was like, I'm picking whatever sounds interesting, and now I'm like, you're going out of your way to make clear this is not for me. Where like I don't know, 10 years ago, I don't think that would have happened, and like that specific sort of like target group thing is something that I'm not sure I'm happy with. I mean,
Yeah, I can
obviously, I'm not happy
understand.
with it.
Yeah. Was a political like not a, how do you call it, a diplomatic way of phrasing it. I'm not sure I'm happy
Yeah,
with it.
yeah, we're trying diplomacy for tonight.
Though there is sometimes when I feel like, okay, when somebody tries to recommend me certain books, and then I feel like they're more sort of like intended for like highbrow guys, and then I'm like, yeah, whatever, and I'm not really that interested in that.
I can't wait for me to actually get like a highbrow, but my hair loss is for whatever reason not kicking in. I guess I have to stay with Drizzt. No more smart books for me. But yeah, I mean that's obviously like another thing is like the way that sort of like reading or talking about specific books is sort of tied to identities nowadays, and they're like, yeah, okay, so you're reading like McCarthy, and you're reading Don DeLillo, and you're reading fucking Thomas Pynchon. I guess you're like a lit bro, and I'm like, no, I mean I enjoy some of those books, but I'm totally not. I don't want to be that guy. And then you have like people go like, yeah, so I guess you're reading Twilight and you're enjoying it. I guess you're, well, either a teenage girl or a wine mom at this point, I guess. It's like, no, I'm not. I'm just enjoying this specific book. And the way it's sort of like tied into specific identities that are presented on social media and so forth, I think it can make it harder for people to pick up books because it's also sort of like extroverted, like all about like building an identity in a lot of ways. And I'm like, I don't think that's good. It's like, I might read Twilight at some point. Will I talk about it? Probably not, because what will people think about me if I tell them that I enjoyed Twilight? I mean, I don't know. Probably it's very likely that I won't enjoy Twilight. I'm just saying the way that you have like this, that being a public reader, I guess, versus being like a private reader is one of those interesting things that has happened with BookTube in a way, right? I mean, you and me,
Yeah,
we are public readers because people know what we read.
yeah, exactly, indeed.
Mhm. Does that influence your choices of books, though?
Uh, my choices, no, but I do sometimes feel the pressure to like certain things because a lot of
Mhm.
people like it, or because somebody who I respect likes it, and then I
Yeah,
feel like, oh shit, maybe
yeah,
it's better than I think it is, or whatever. And I mainly have that actually after the fact, when it's been,
yeah.
I don't know, 2 years since I've read it, and all I remember is not liking it, and then somebody
Mm.
else is like, oh, I really love this book, and then I'm like, oh shit, maybe I just didn't fully get
Yeah,
it. Maybe I should reread it. Whereas then I reread it, and I'm like, oh no, didn't like it for this and that reason.
yeah, yeah. And that's like one of those things. Like this pressure is something that I sometimes I read books and I'm like, I'm not gonna tell anyone about it because I'm gonna read this for myself. I want to deal with this on my own. You don't you don't get to know what I think about this book, which is why I read The Spear Cuts Through Water, which like everyone told me to read for like the last 2 years, and I just like read it like 2 months like a month ago, and I'm like, yeah, I'm just gonna read it, not telling anyone about it. It's good. It's a good book, but I'm trying to not be sort of be caught up in that situation, and it's kind of difficult to do that. And sometimes I don't want to be just a public reader. I guess is my point, which is kind of weird. But because I mean, you and me, we're still talking about like very small channels, right?
Yeah.
It's not we're not fucking Daniel Green with like 500,000 subscribers or whatever, right? We're down here in the dregs. There's like maybe 5 people who actually care about what we read.
Well, maybe it's more difficult for smaller channels to make this decision than for bigger ones, because when it's a bigger channel, maybe like it's you no longer have like as close of a relationship with most of your subscribers.
Yeah.
So it kind of starts to not matter as much anymore, maybe as well, because you cannot really put a face on the people that are watching your channel.
Yeah, that might be it, right? It's like if I don't read Spear Cuts for Water, I know 5 specific people that will judge me for it.
Yeah, exactly.
And they can keep on judging. Because I know as soon as I tell Evie, for example, that I have read Spear Cuts for Water, she will tell me that I have to read The Vanished Birds. And I'm like,
She's like, fine, finally got this one book. Now let's dump these other books on him.
yeah, you give them like one finger and they take their entire hand, and
Of course.
that hand being like another 10 books. But that's like the things like, do you deliberately go like, I read this book for myself and then I read this book and I'll talk about this book, or is it something that you like every book you read you'll talk about on the channel?
Every book I read, I'll talk about because I do the wrap ups. So I definitely will talk about every book. And then occasionally there will be a book that I want to talk about more, in the sense that I'll do a video about it. But that actually doesn't happen as much as I would like, because I let too much time slip by and then I feel like I don't remember enough of it.
Yeah, I've had that where I read a book and I'm like, I'm gonna make a video about it, and then I got distracted. And like it was like 2 months later, and I'm like, I guess I have to reread it now because I don't remember anything. So do the channel plans actually sort of like dictate your TBR, or is it more like the other way around?
Sorry, channel plans, what are those?
Do your channel plans sort of like dictate your TBR and like how you're gonna read, or is it the other way around?
No, I meant I don't have channel plans. I just go with the flow.
Yeah, it's the best way, I guess. Which is how I ended up reading fucking 100 Years of Solitude, which was not on the plan. I just like woke up and like, I'm annoyed by how no one ever reads Ian MacDonald, and I'm like, okay. And I've read this book before, and I know it's basically inspired by 100 Years of Solitude. So I'm going to read a lot of Ian MacDonald, but before I do that, I'm going to read 100 Years of Solitude because someone asked me.
Well, I don't go as much with the flow as you do. I guess
my flow is very much like rapids all the time.
Yeah, I think my TBR determines my reading.
Yeah.
And then the hope is that one day we'll get to 0 TBR again, and then I'll do some actual thinking about what I want to be reading and like what I'm going to prioritize and what videos I might want to make, and like get books for that.
How long did it take, like after you did your like first like 0 TBR thing? Like how long did it take for you to actually have like an out of control TBR after that?
I mean, I never got back to an out of control TBR. But the day after I got to 0 TBR, I went to the bookstore and I bought 17 books. So, I mean, it was me. And I think the most out of control it got after that is I raised it back up to like 35 or something like that. That's the furthest it has gone in the meantime. But so it was never really as out of control as it had been before that. But it did get back to that point where
Mhm.
I was like, oh yeah, this book has been on my TBR for
Yeah,
like a year now. I need to read it, which is what I was trying to avoid with this whole concept of the zero TBR.
yeah. I feel like I don't like the idea of like a TBR list. I have this sort of like I always describe it as like having like this cloud of books that are sort of like on my radar. I'm like, I want to read those books. And whenever I have like time and space, I'm like, whatever is closest to my brain at that moment is going to be read next. But there's like, stuff that I'm aware of. And I'm like, I would probably like this. I should probably read this at some point. And if it hits me at the right point, then I'm going to read it. But it's the whole like putting it into like a list or something just kind of makes me anxious. Lists makes me anxious. I'm not exactly a very structured person.
Yeah, I guess I have the opposite where I'm like, if I don't put this in a list, I'm gonna forget about it, and then I
Yeah.
feel like I would be missing out something. In reality, probably not. There'll just
Mhm.
be other stuff that's on my radar that then gets priority just because I can remember it.
Yeah.
So it's just like a thing in the brain where it's like, no, no, I need to keep these books on my want to read list, even though I don't even remember why they're on this
Mhm.
list anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like the only things where I'm like, I'm gonna read this at this specific point in time is like when I looked at the, like new releases this year. I'm like, I'm gonna read those on like day one, and
Yeah.
those will happen at day one. Like stuff like Blackheart Man, which happened on day three because of delays and stuff, and Six Lives, and there's one for September, I think. Darkholme, which probably once again no one will read except me, by Hanu Rajaniemi, which
Don't
is
know it.
Finnish, which is why you don't have to pronounce it in like weird ways, because Finns don't pronounce stuff in weird ways. They just use more letters than anyone else. It's like I liked like the Quantum Thief was like his first one. He's like does weird sci-fi stuff, and the Quantum Thief, and that's a trilogy, and I keep forgetting the other two. One is called the Fractal Prince, and the other one is called the something 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 mathematical something else.
How that one?
Look, I can't remember it right now, and I think the Fractal Prince is the third one, I think, and there's one in between, and they always have like the author is a mathematician by trade, like he's got a PhD in mathematics, and a lot of mathematical concepts kind of come into that sort of. And it was just like really interesting and fascinating in the way he does weird. It's like a heist story, but it also uses weird like weird mathematical stuff and Finnish culture. And I'm like, yeah, that's cool. And then he wrote Summerlands, which is about uh, a British spy novel with ghosts. And by ghosts, I mean like people can contact the dead to ask them for information, which is sort of this one part of like MI5, MI6, MI7, whatever, doing the thing. It's just like weird. And it's doing something about like bioengineering and gene technology now. And yeah, it's the one book in September that I'm looking forward to because I might not like it, but I know it's gonna do weird shit that I'm gonna be thinking about afterwards. The Causal Angel. Thanks, Ori. That's the one. See the something something mathematical something else.
Yeah, it sounds like it's exactly the same.
Yeah, so like the Quantum Thief, the Causal Angel, and the Fractal Prince, and I think they're all worth reading. They're just like very unique in what he does. And Summerlands was just like straight up weird. It's like talking to former spies in somewhere in the ether because they're dead and slowly fading and stuff. You know, it does weird things, and I like weird things, which is probably why I'm fine with like magical realism.
Yeah.
Because magical realism is basically let's make political novels but use weird things because we can't say the real thing.
Yeah. More or less, yeah.
The whole banana company part in 100 Years of Solitude fucked me up so bad. It's like, yeah, I know what you're talking about, man. It's brutal. And the way he talks about like how no one remembers it, yeah, that was dark.
Yeah, that I have no memory of. Should we read it?
See, I gotta hit you with some stuff that you don't remember. That's like when the banana company comes and then what's this like Jose Arcadio Secondo does like the workers strike, and then they all get like gunned down, and the bodies get carried out of the town on the train, and he just wakes up just slightly wounded in that thing in the train, just like walks back to Macondo, and no one remembers that the thing actually happened, and everyone talks about like how there was like a peaceful protest, and then the company agreed to doing the right thing and give everyone like actual toilets and maybe even access to doctors, and everyone dispersed happily, and everyone around him tells him that it never happened, and later on he goes like, yeah, but this didn't happen, like all the school books tell us that it didn't happen, and it's based on like a real actual thing where like an American fruit company gunned down a bunch of workers in Colombia, and
Yeah,
yes, no one talks about it. And the way he does
yeah,
that, that's sort of like the power of magical realism, right? When you can use those things and go like, yeah, clearly this is magic and also fucked up.
yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's the kind of thing where like something like 100 Years of Solitude just works really well for me. When I'm, yeah, I see what you're doing there.
Yeah, exactly.
But then again, Garcia Marquez was a socialist, so no big
Just
surprise. I'm kind
surprised.
of on board with him. Now, man, I think that's like one of those things that we often forget, and I feel that's like something that Salman Rushdie kind of forgot when he talks about how he's not writing fantasy about magical realism. Is that a lot of like, as at least the Latin American magical realism is politically driven, and
Mm.
Salman Rushdie's politics, as far as I can tell, are incredibly conservative, and that doesn't necessarily gel with magical realism. It's like having reality sort of melt away is one thing, but to make it actually works needs something more. You need to sort of be unhappy with the situation right now.
Yeah, I don't know enough about Salman Rushdie but I do know that like the term magical realism is very much taken out of its Latin American context and used on a ton of stuff that you're like, this is not magical realism. It's not because it has like low fantasy level elements that it automatically becomes magical
Yeah.
realism, which is what marketing tries to do sometimes.
The funny thing is, like, magical realism, like so many things that ended up in the 50s and 60s in Latin America, came originally from Germany. The term was originally like a German term called Magischer Realismus, and it's like
But
had
it
a
was
massive
more in
impact
art,
throughout the.
right?
What?
It came more from the art scene, right?
Yes, I think it came more from the arts, and then it kind of sort of like some literary people, and then it kind of get translated. And I just wanted to make a bad Nazi joke, but
Perfectly fine. I'm gonna have to jump out for a second because I'm having a allergy attack here, so
oh
I'll be
no,
back. No, I'll be back for just in. I just need to go and blow my nose, basically.
do that. Okay, like Britain, I don't think Salman Rushdie is like a reactionary or anything of the sorts. I would never say that. I think from what I can tell, he's mostly a very elitist snob. At least over the last couple of years, or whatever. And I read it. I haven't read enough Rushdie to make any like full-on sort of statements on it. It's more like I read his essays, and they're very cultural elitist kind of thing, and just didn't feel like he's not exactly looking for progress. He's like very much an elitist in that regard. He might be, liberal, definitely, but liberal in that very elitist kind of way, and doesn't vibe with me. Is my point. So I didn't want to call him like a, I didn't mean like right-wing conservative. I just think he's more of like a sort of liberal person than a progressive person. Yeah, that's what I mean, right? He goes like, well, no, I'm not writing fantasy. Fantasy is trash. I'm writing magical realism, which is good. Also, the other good fantasy books are obviously only by British authors, and it's Tolkien and J.K. Rowling. I'm like, Salman, my man, I'm really sorry about all the things you've gone through, but J.K. Rowling is not a good writer. Harry Potter is not magical realism. It's also not necessarily good children's fiction. It's just books.
But it's also like Margaret Atwood also does that. Like
Yeah,
she with was it with The Handmaid's Tale that she's like, no,
it's
it's not
speculative
dystopian,
fiction.
it's speculative. Yes, indeed. And then all of a sudden it is acceptable literature again.
What should I take back? That Harry Potter is not good? I don't know. I don't think it's, Harry Potter is not magical realism, is my point. I have no very deep convictions about Harry Potter. I'm not an expert. I just say, like, I've read 3 books and they suck. Yeah, the Margaret Atwood thing is sort of like the same thing. It's like trying to distance herself because she tries, and it annoys me because it kind of reinforces those like genre differentiation and that hierarchy. And
Mhm.
it's like, look, we can talk about the fact that there's a lot of like very run of the mill kind of genre fiction out there. We can talk about that. And there's certainly bad fiction out there. We can talk about that, but going like, I'm not part of this genre because this entire genre is basically trash. I want to play with the big boys and do serious literary fiction.
Mhm.
It feels like being a class traitor, basically.
Yeah, definitely. Because
And it
it
annoys me.
100% is a dystopian, like.
Yeah. And that's kind of the thing is it feels like sort of trying disavowing the people that kind of made you big by going like, nah, I'm not part of that genre. I'm doing the serious thing. And it just like reestablishes. It's that whole like divide and conquer thing that capitalism does so well, where you build this whole like structure, and we don't have that much money in literature, we don't have that much funding, so we need to sort of like kick everyone who's slightly lower down to make sure that we still get some recognition. And I'm like, I thought you were like, progressive and against all those things, and you had like this critical view, and then at the end of the day, you cave in and just like play the game anyway, and it just,
Yeah.
I don't know, doesn't make me very happy, I guess. Because this is diplomacy Saturday. We don't,
I guess.
we try to be polite. I haven't read Midnight Children yet. I still have to read that. And I will read more Salman Rushdie. I think, there's good stuff in there. I just like his essay collection, the last one. That man, he's talking way too much about like how he has a leather chair and like an ancient wooden desk, and how he has all these like Shakespeare books in his bookshelf. And like, at this point, fuck you. You're a pretentious snob. You're done.
Yeah, I only read the Quixote one,
Okay.
which wasn't a success for me.
Thing is, I haven't read that, but what are your opinions on the original Don Quixote?
It is way too long. That will be my opinion on it. It did interesting things, but it was way too long.
I was surprised by how like modern it read for something that is
Yes.
like 400 years old at this point. I'm like, wow.
Yeah, especially like the second volume
The
has a lot of
second part,
meta.
like,
Yeah.
this is like serious, like metafiction stuff
Yeah,
going
exactly.
down. And it kind of frustrates me how like it's one of those things like Don Quixote might be like the second most misread book when it comes to these kind of things after 1984, when everyone goes like, "You're tilting against windmills." Like, have you read the book? You're using the metaphor wrong, motherfucker. The whole like tilting against windmills thing kind of just like fucks me up how people use it versus like what actually happens in the novel. And it's not about using it like it's useless to do that. It's like, no, this is about delusion. It's not about
Yeah.
fighting something useless. And what can you do? The English world misunderstanding the Spanish. It has never happened before, I'm sure. But yeah, no, I personally was like, what was interesting for me was like I listened to an audiobook version, and it was the Tobias Smollett translation, which is interesting in that it is a 18th century translation, because audiobooks often use like old translations because they're out of copyright, so you don't have to pay anyone to do your audiobook for a classic. It's cheaper. And Tobias Smollett wrote a bunch of like 18th century, and this is just me being me, right? I knew of Smollett before because I've studied way too much 18th century stuff for my PhD that I never finished. But he wrote a bunch of like comedic novels in the 18th century, and he translated it into English. And it's really interesting to see how that translation sort of takes stuff that a modern translation would do very, very differently, but adapts it in like an 18th century British sort of like sensibility, and does stuff. You get all the in your face anti-Semitism in that book because it's the 18th century. No one cares. And modern translators, unless you do like an academic translation, would probably try to sort of scoot around that. And he just goes like for things that wouldn't fly today by any means. And it's just interesting to see. Was interesting for me to see how that kind of worked. But yeah, I agree. It's very long, and there's certainly parts in there that don't necessarily work for a modern audience.
Yeah, it's very repetitive, which, as I said, I don't like those type of like procedurals or like monster of the day type of things, and that is very much what this book is for a lot of its page counts.
Yeah.
And then it also didn't help that I wanted to read it in Spanish, and so I read it in like a Spanish with like annotations and like original spelling and in parts, and I was like, okay, thanks for making it so much harder on yourself.
Have you read that? Have you read that Don Quixote short story by Borges?
No, I haven't.
But you know which one I mean, right?
No, I only know
it's a Borges story, and it's about this guy who rewrites Don Quixote in the 1950s or whatever, when Borges wrote that thing, right? And he just uses the same words and just like writes the same text word by word again in Spanish. And it's about how that is still not the same text because the context has changed.
Yeah,
it's Borges doing Borges things. So
yeah, Borges is very interesting.
I know.
I should read more of him, because basically I've only read the short story that is like the path of branching. I don't know what it is like in English.
Which one's that?
The forest of splitting paths or something like that. It must be.
Yeah, that might make sense. Yeah. I think that's the one that like inspired Umberto Eco to use the metaphor of the forest for his like literary theory. Because obviously Eco is a huge Borges fan.
Yeah. So I have only read that when I was studying Spanish, and I should read more Borges because I really like that short story, even though I don't really remember much about it now. But
yeah, no, I've read like a collection, like one of those collections of short stories. The ones that have like, I don't know, obviously the Library of Babel in it, and the Aleph, and a couple more, and they're all really interesting. But like that whole like fiction thing that Eco, like, you have read Name of the Rose, right?
No.
Name of the Rose is Umberto Eco paying homage to Borges, but also making fun of him because the bad guy is called the monk is called it's one of the monks. He's called Jorge of Burgos. I'm like, yeah, I see what you did there. And he's a blind librarian. It's like, yeah, I get it. No, but like what Echo did, and I think it's a really interesting thing. I want to make a video on it, like on like Echo's like theories of literary interpretation. Is like texts are like a forest. And as an author, you can lay paths in that forest, and the reader can pick which path they want to take. Which also means that you can, and interpretations are different paths through that forest of the text. Basically, everyone gets their own path, basically. But you can also get lost in the forest, and that's sort of like when misinterpretation happens. But I love that as an image to go like, well, you have this text, and there's like the straight one. You just like go for the plot, and you go through, and that's that. Or you can just meander around and look at stuff, and it's a different interpretation. And it can also just like get lost and never come out, and that's when you misinterpret the text. And it's a very powerful image for what we do when we read books.
Yeah, I like it. It's a very nice way to put it.
And I think it's very much inspired by that, the Garden of Forking Paths or whatever it's called, that one.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess it's one of the benefits of working on that fucking conspiracy video forever. It's reading way too much Umberto Eco. Well, now we know that not only science fiction is more than ray guns, but also breakdancing is more than ray gun. How's that for a sports joke that you didn't expect? Did you enjoy the Olympics, though? That's like one of those questions. Yes. Okay.
I did, but there's a lot of drama with it afterwards, for gymnastics, that is. Yeah. And so I'm unfortunately still living through the Olympics because of that. And just like every single day, there's more about some sort of a ruling and them having to decide.
Yeah. Right. I remember that there was the whole like thing about gymnastics. I kind of forgot about the gymnastics part. Like, I obviously didn't look that much at it. I just know that you watch way too much Olympics.
Yeah, and like gymnastics is the thing that I watch the most. I want to watch some of the Paralympics because I watched the opening ceremony, but I haven't watched anything else this week so far.
Yeah, I haven't. Obviously, I don't watch anything. I don't do sports. I'm not a sports person.
I wouldn't call myself a sports person either, but I do like watching some of it, not all of it. Like not the typical things, like not like football or something like that.
I feel like the thing with the Paralympics is that since I went to like a boarding school for blind people, I've met a bunch of Paralympics people in my life, and that kind of takes away some of the magic. So yeah, that is just like the same kind of asshole I am. It's like which is a good thing. Don't get me wrong. It just also goes like, why would I watch them on TV? But yeah.
I want to watch some because I don't actually know much about like the subcategories and all of that sort of deal.
Yeah. And that's like one of those fascinating things. Like, I'd love to do something with that. It's like, if you're a runner in the Paralympics, if you're a blind runner, you always have, obviously, you have like a pilot runner that runs with you, right? That's sort of like how blind people do like marathons and shit like that. You have like someone who just like sort of runs with you and you connect by like a string or whatever, right? And if we're talking like top athletics, the person who does the pilot running also has to be a fucking top athlete, right? Athlete. He has to be like, they have to be as fast as this, in this case, blind athlete. But no one talks about those people because their job is just to sort of facilitate that other person's success in that regard.
Yeah,
but that's just like super fascinating.
I think they did change it where like since London or something like that, I think they also get a medal. Before they didn't get the medal, the ones who were like the guides. But now I think they also get a medal.
Yeah. And that's kind of the weird thing with them is like, there's someone who just like also ran like, I don't know, 100 meters in, 11 seconds. That's fucking impressive. I couldn't do that. No, but we don't look at that person. And yeah, it's just like interesting in like how it kind of shifts focus on like who gets to be sort of like in the spotlight and who doesn't get to be in the spotlight, depending on the framing, I guess. I just found that very interesting in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of as well with like translation. It's also similar where you
Yeah,
had like the Booker International Prize, which is given to both the original author and the translator
yeah,
uh, of the book.
because the translators still has to do like the same kind of level of like work,
Yeah.
possibly more so because they have to kind of figure out meanings and shit.
Yeah, it's kind of different. Just like the other person, of course, has to have the inspiration and work out the concept and how the plot is going to work. But then the translator has to figure out indeed how to best portray that into
Yeah,
the other language.
yeah. I've never tried to translate more than like a couple of sentences, and it's hard. It's so fucking hard.
Yeah, I did a year of translation studies, but what I found the hardest were actually like the the legal documents and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, because
Then you
there
have
you
to
have
do a
like
ton of
accuracy is
research.
really important there, right?
Yeah, so then you have to do a ton of research to figure out what the exact term is that you need.
Yeah. I just did. I just translated like box text from like old D&D adventures for like the adventure running. It's like I want to use the box text, so I'm going to translate that shit into German, and that's how I spent some very interesting math lectures at university.
Or yeah, the scientific ones. That was also horrible. Translating a scientific text on like a subject that you know nothing about.
Yeah, that's bad. Yeah, but that's the things like with those things that accuracy is sort of like something that you can measure, right? You can
Hmm.
look up and go like, this is the correct term. But once that leaves you because you're doing fiction, suddenly you're making choices,
Yeah.
and suddenly you have like a responsibility that goes like, I can't justify this beyond like I feel this is correct.
Hmm.
Like the book would go like, this is the correct term. It's like, no, I think in this context I feel this is the correct term. Suddenly you're in the bind versus like, you know, something that is sort of like semi-objective in that you have like a correspondence in some books somewhere where you can go like, yeah, this is how I have to translate this specific term.
Yeah, definitely. Like in some ways, indeed easier because it's just about finding that term, but
I feel
that
like
just
what
takes more work. But
yeah,
but when you're doing a translation for literature, then of course, indeed, there is no clear-cut rule about what is right translation. Oh, I think I lost you. Oh, wait. Yeah, there you are.
yeah, it's like physical work versus like work of the soul, where you have like, this is on me.
Yeah, and like then like I took a course in like
Yeah,
children translation of children's novels, and then you have like the question of whether you're going to translate names, for example, which
yeah,
is like your first start already. Like, are you going to keep the original names, or are you going to change them to the names of the
yeah.
culture that you're translating for?
That's super interesting. Like with the so Tolkien has some interesting translations to go back to like fantasy topics, right? There's an old German translation of the Lord of the Rings, and in those they translated most of the names into German. So like Rivendell is Bruchtal, which is a very good translation. It's like because Riven, means to break apart. So like they turned that into like a German term, and they turned the Baggins is changed into German Beutlin because Beutel is German for like a bag, more like a tote bag kind of thing. But yeah, so there are choices made to turn it into like a German. And then when they translated The Hobbit, they didn't.
Hmm.
Suddenly it's Baggins, and because it was a different translator, and it's interesting to see that. And then they did a new German translation of Lord of the Rings later on, and they changed things there again because, like in the old German translation, when Sam calls Frodo, he calls him when in German, in English, he calls him like Mr. Frodo, or sometimes he calls him Master. And in German, they translated it back in the old time. They translated it as Herr, which means sort of like Lord, Master, whatever you want to call it. And the new one, they translated it as chef, which just means boss. And I'm like,
Hmm.
you're missing an entire like social context that is sort of important for the pseudo-Victorian sort of like background. It's like Frodo is not just his boss; he's more than that. He's his master. There's a difference, and just like interesting to see how those things shift over time.
Yeah. Yeah, I also did like a thesis on two different translations of a children's book to kind of also look at those differences and like the shifts that were made in those decisions.
Yeah. All right, I'm looking at the time. We've been doing this for like almost 2.5 hours. The question is, do I get another beer? Because I'm running out of beer now. Do I get another beer, or should we slowly end this? It's up to you.
Yeah, I think we should probably slowly wrap off because it's already like 11:30.
Yeah, and you probably have some very angry, hungry cats out there.
No, they don't. They get their food in the morning, so they
Ah,
get to stay angry for a little bit longer.
do they get angry when you're awake too long?
No, not really. They get angry when I stay in bed too long.
Ah,
Then
okay.
they'll be on the other side of the door, like, meow, I know that you're awake. I can hear that you're on your phone.
I had that with my cat, with my dogs. I was like when I was finishing my thesis, and I was like, the student thing where you write until like 4 in the morning because obviously you have a deadline and you ignore it for like way too long.
Yes.
And my dog was coming down, just like lying in she had like a basket upstairs in like the living room and like a blanket on the floor next to me under my bed where I usually sit at my desk, and she was like lying there and snoring, and I was still typing. At some point she just like got up and came over and just like laid her head on my knee, and just like that head got heavier and heavier and heavier. It was like, dude, you gotta sleep. And I'm like, sorry dog, I have to finish this. She did not accept that. This is like, no, you gotta stop working now. I want to sleep under your bed, and you're annoying me by typing.
Well, maybe it would be different if they were allowed in my bedroom. Then maybe they would also be like, we want to move to the bed. But now it's like, if I go to bed, it means that they don't see me anymore. So they
Yeah.
don't
Okay.
want me to.
Yeah, that's a good way. Like for me, like having a bunk bed where I sleep upstairs and having a dog that don't necessarily are good at like climbing ladders made it very easy to have the dog sleeping there. And it's like, yeah, I guess you can sleep under my bed. It's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I occasionally allow the cats to sleep in my bedroom, but this is not a good idea because Buffy will just literally just like put her face like in my face. It's just like, I cannot sleep like this. Go away.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cats are like that. All right. In that case, let's slowly end this. And thank you once again for hanging out. Thank you everyone in the chat for still hanging out with us. I'm sure we appreciate that. I mean, I do, and I
Yes.
suspect Clio does too.
Yes.
So yeah, I once again like thank you very much. I had a lot of fun. I hope you had a lot of fun, and yeah, go subscribe to Clio's channel if you haven't yet. It's worth it. Trust me. She's also reading all the books at once. Also, I've heard.
Yes. I'm reading all my currently owned books, so there's a lot of chaos in my future and my present.
We approve of chaos. So yeah, thank you once again, and yeah, I guess I'll see you somewhere in the future with like another video. Next book I'll be reading is Desolation Road by Ian MacDonald, which go read if you can find it somewhere. It might be hard to find because no one ever talks about that guy, no one reads that guy. Also, it's 100 Years of Solitude on Mars with suicidal robots. And who could say no to that, right? So yeah, see you around and have a good night, everyone, and all of that. Sorry, I can't cheers because I finished my beer and I feel bad about that now. Anyway, let me pretend with an empty beer. I cheer you with this, the ruins of tonight. Cheers.